Okay, my name is Mariah Gladstone and I run IndigiKitchen, which is an online teaching tool dedicated to the revitalization of Indigenous food systems. I'm filming this from my house in Babb along Duck Lake, where I can see Chief Mountain and of course have an opportunity to show you guys some of the wonderful Indigenous plants and talk about traditional harvesting ethics. Foods. I'm going to provide a brief lesson on some harvesting ethics, especially when harvesting for our native plants and looking for ways to ensure that we're able to collect food and medicines and resources for ourselves while still maintaining the strength of our ecosystems. So there's a couple of principles that I like to apply whenever I'm foraging, and I'm out here with a whole bunch of potential plants that I could harvest, so I'm going to apply these in real time as we're looking at stuff. A lot of these principles are actually written down by my wonderful graduate advisor, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and one of the chapters of her book is actually called The Honorable Harvest, in which she outlines some of these Indigenous ethics and protocol for safe and ethical harvesting and ways that we, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous people, can practice reciprocity and sustainability within all of our delicious, healthy, and fun foraging. Obviously, this is a serviceberry or savisberry plant here, and this is a time of the year when the berries aren't quite ripe, but we can see them forming. We also see that we're in a patch of many more bushes, and so I apply the principle to never take the first of any of the plants that I see, and also to never take the last. We want to ensure that, one, we're making sure that we're already recognizing that we're in a deeply established population before we start to harvest from that population. And also, we want to make sure that we're never taking the last of anything in the area. We want the plants to continue to regenerate themselves. For this plant, if we're talking about harvesting the berries, then we really want to make sure that we're still leaving some berries behind. We want to make sure that the birds and the bears are able to access that food resource as well. However, it's not quite in the time of the year for harvesting berries, but the leaves actually make a great tea. So if we start taking leaves, we want to make sure that we're picking selectively and not stripping an entire branch of all of its leaves. We want to make sure that we're still leaving plenty of leaves behind to photosynthesize, and so that plant can keep producing the sugars that it needs to feed the ripening berries. Another great principle is, of course, to always leave something behind. For Indigenous people and for Blackfeet people, we often leave behind tobacco. This is traditionally done by taking our tobacco and giving it back to the earth and to the plants that are so generously offering themselves for our food and medicine resource. So I try to leave behind some tobacco. If not tobacco, sometimes people will leave behind some red willow bark, or some of our other medicine plants in that way. Sometimes that can also take the shape of watering the plant, just to offer that plant a little bit of water from your hiking pack or whatever that may be. Sometimes that may be going into the plant patch and pulling invasive species. I'm seeing a Canadian thistle over here, and so one way of giving back could be to help eliminate that harmful competition that's not indigenous to this landscape. So there are different things that can be done in that way. Another great principle is, of course, only to take what we need. We don't want to be over harvesting or to be taking things that we aren't going to have the opportunity to use and dry and share with people. which is just, of course, a basic principle of what we're actually able to consume. If we're harvesting a ton of berries, do we have plans? Do we have the storage to store all those berries, whether drying them or in our freezer, or whether using them immediately? Whatever the case may be, make sure that you're only harvesting what you are planning on using. Brings me to something else I mentioned, which is of course the principle of sharing. Whenever you're harvesting, ensure that you're sharing what you've harvested with others. Sometimes that may be your family, that may be using those resources to prepare meals, that may be sharing and providing medicines for other people. I'm seeing raspberries down here, and they're not yet blooming, but I do see these beautiful raspberry leaves, which make a great tea. And of course, there's a big raspberry patch here, so I'd feel comfortable harvesting selectively from this patch to ensure that the raspberries are still able to produce, but also so that we're able to get some tea at this time when the leaves are nice and early in the year. There's a couple of plants in this patch that I wouldn't feel comfortable harvesting from. There's actually a cow parsnip back here. You can see its white flower, and I'm only seeing one of those plants in this specific patch. I see a couple of leaves from another one over here, but I'm not seeing any other cow parsnip. Sometimes this is called Indian celery. Regardless, I wouldn't want to harvest this from this patch here unless I was seeing others in the immediate area. That's just to make sure that this plant, as an indigenous plant, as something that's traditionally part of our beneficial food ecosystems, is able to regenerate itself. I would also really want to be sure of the identification of those plants before I harvest. Cow parsnip can look a little bit similar to water hemlock, and so you want to be careful because water hemlock is an extremely poisonous plant. Cow parsnip, on the other hand, can be used for a variety of uses, and so you really want to make sure that you recognize and are 100% certain of the identification before you're harvesting anything. There's a couple of other plants in here that I'm seeing as well, but the ones that I will mention are this fireweed right here. So fireweed has a lot of great edible flowers. You can see that these flowers can be picked individually. You can take a couple from a plant and obviously not cause any harm to the plant, but as long as you're leaving something behind, that plant is still going to be able to produce seeds and to continue to spread fireweed. I also see other fireweed plants over here off screen, and so I know that this is a good healthy population of fireweed. I can also look back here and I see at least 7, 10, 15 other fireweed plants that haven't gone into flowering stages yet. So you also want to make sure that obviously you're only taking what you plan on using and you're using everything that you're taking. So I just picked this fireweed flower, which means it must be used. It's also really important to recognize that these animals and plants that we harvest are really important to these ecosystems, just as we are. We have been here for thousands and thousands of years and peacefully coexisting together. And as part of that, it's really important to recognize them not as things that we are harvesting and taking, but really as other beings who are generously giving up themselves so that we are able to nourish ourselves as well. When we think of plants, animals, whether that's wild game or fish or birds or whatever that may be, as beings, then we recognize that their gift to us, to nourish us, to take care of us, must also in turn be reciprocated. That's why we give things back. That's why we understand that this is a gift and we can in turn bring gifts. We know what is important to keep this beautiful patch of space alive, and we can do work to take care of that moving forward. So I see some of these plants, I see some underbrush that could be cleared out, and I could give back to that place in this way. I could pull thistles and I could provide water for this place and continue to care for it. And then of course, you know, if I'm ever harvesting plants with, like I'm harvesting the root of certain plants, I think it's really important to return the seeds of that plant to the ground as I'm harvesting the root. If you're harvesting the root of plants, then obviously you're in turn killing the entire plant, that entire being, when it is being harvested. And so it's really important, not just for the biodiversity of the ecosystem, but also as that basic principle of giving back to the earth and ensuring that that plant is able to continue future generations, even though we are harvesting that. So I think about camas when I think about this. Traditionally, Blackfeet people harvested the camas bulbs after they had gone to seed, and that process would then, with the digging of camas bulbs, the sprinkling of those seeds back on the freshly turned soil would help those bulbs regenerate themselves and make really healthy camas meadows. Similarly, when we look at prairie turnips, we look at plants that we harvested after they went to seed, and that process of digging these big roots also came with spreading those seeds out. And just that principle can really help ensure continuous healthy numbers of those populations. In fact, without indigenous harvesting principles, some of those plants actually have their numbers reduced because they have been relying on us for thousands of years to spread their seeds and to continue to take care of them. And so I think it's important for all wild ethical harvests to recognize these essential principles, and obviously recognize safety whenever you're out harvesting, continue to share, and continue to recognize the abundant gifts of this landscape, and also find ways to give gifts back in return.